much social science writing. Many of the books, book chapters, articles that you read about will revolve around thesis statements. In this video, you'll learn more about what thesis statements are, what are their characteristics. You'll get a chance to review good thesis statement and some not so good thesis statements with the idea of identifying what's wrong with them, all in the interest of helping you develop good thesis statements for your future term papers at UOIT. You'll also do a practice writing assignment this week in which you develop good thesis statements. So what is a thesis statement? A thesis statement is a hypothesis or a proposition or an argument that you will attempt to support or refute in your writing. Thesis statements have several characteristics. We'll talk about three in particular. Thesis statements express the relationship between at least two concepts. Thesis statements are specific, and thesis statements can be tested, supported, or proven false. So these three characteristics are important to remember that thesis statements express the relation between two concepts, they're specific, and can be tested. So here's an example of a good thesis statement. Playing violent video games in the preteen years increases the risk of violent crime among young adults. Why is this a good thesis statement? Well, it has the three characteristics that I just mentioned. It expresses the relation between at least two concepts, and those two concepts are playing violent video games in the preteen years, that's one, and the other is violent crime among young adults. So it expresses the relationship between these two concepts. The thesis statement is specific. Playing violent video games is very clear about what we're referring to, and violent crime among young adults is also specific. And the third characteristic is that it's testable. One could do research, original research, to test whether playing violent video games in the preteen years actually increases the risk of violent crime among young adults. Okay, so let's explore thesis statements a little bit further by trying to identify what are the two concepts involved in the following thesis statements. Alcohol intoxication increases the risk of domestic violence. So if you've identified that the two concepts are alcohol intoxication and the risk of domestic violence, good job. What are the two concepts tested here? The threat of long prison sentences deters people from committing violent crimes. So one concept is the threat of a long prison sentence, and the second is committing violent crimes. Pretty easy, right? Let's try it again. Children from single-parent homes are more likely to engage in antisocial behavior than are children with two parents living at home. Okay, so the two concepts here are whether a child has a single-parent home or has two parents living at home, and the second is the likelihood of engaging in antisocial behavior. People with university degrees are less likely to engage in minor criminal offenses than are people with less education. So the two concepts here are level of education and the likelihood of engaging in minor criminal offenses. Try another one. Public service announcements depicting horrific traffic accidents cause young adults to drive more responsibly. So one concept is exposure to public service announcements depicting horrific traffic accidents, and the other is the tendency to drive responsibly. Okay, let's move on to the next section, which is trying to identify problems with the thesis statements. I'm going to give several samples of thesis statements that have one problem or another, and let's see if we can identify them. Crime in Canada is on the decline. What's wrong with this thesis statement? Well, does it describe the relation between at least two concepts? Well, it's not so clear. Crime in Canada is one concept, but what's the other? Is it specific? What kind of crime? When we say on the decline, relative to what? Relative to another country? relative to a different time period, it's not very specific. Is it testable? Well, without putting in some more of these specifics, it would be difficult to test also. Let's look at another. There is a relationship between ethnicity and crime. Does the thesis statement test the relationship between at least two concepts? Well, it appears to do that. It's appearing to test the relationship between ethnicity and crime. So we seem okay there. What about specificity? Well, ethnicity is a very broad category, and so is crime. So it's not very specific. Most people oppose the death penalty. Are we testing the relationship between at least two concepts here? I don't think so. Teenage youth are more likely than adults to have unconscious thoughts about committing sexual assault. Well, let's evaluate this. Are we testing the relationship between at least two concepts? Well, it would seem so. We're comparing teenage youth and adults with respect to their level of unconscious thoughts about committing sexual assault. So we seem okay there. Is it specific? Well, we are specifying teenage youth as compared to adults. We might be okay there. We're pretty specific in referring to unconscious thoughts about committing sexual assault. But is this testable? Would we be able to test and support or refute this thesis statement? It's very hard to measure unconscious thoughts, isn't it? I think we'd have a problem with the third criterion, that the thesis statement must be testable, we must be able to support it or refute it. So there's a problem with this thesis statement as well. Okay, so you've gotten the idea about the characteristics of thesis statements, meaning expressing the relationship between at least two concepts, specific and testable. In your practice writing assignment for this period, we want you to work with these concepts. So when you download the instructions, you'll see a brief explanation of thesis statements. You'll see some examples of these thesis statements. And in this exercise, I'm going to want you to develop two good quality thesis statements. So they should possess the characteristics that we're talking about. They express the relationship between at least two concepts. They're specific and they're testable. I also want you to develop two not so good thesis statements that have at least one problem. And for each thesis statement, write a one-paragraph essay explaining why the thesis statement is good or not so good. So remember, thesis statements are critical in social science. Much of what you'll be reading about in your books, chapters, and articles are thesis statements and arguments and data in support of thesis statements or refuting thesis statements. You'll be asked to write term papers in which you develop thesis statements and bring other research to bear on these thesis statements. So it's really important that you get a good feeling for what thesis statements are, for identifying problems with thesis statements, and crafting good quality thesis statements that can form the basis for good quality term papers. Remember that your thesis statements must express the relationship between at least two concepts, they must be specific, and they must be testable.